Hi everyone, my name is Eleni. I am the Marketing Manager at the Big Five in Dubai. Thank you for joining our webinar today, How to Put Yourself in the Best Position to Pursue and Defend COVID-related Construction Claims. The webinar will be recorded and everyone will receive the recording within the next week. If you have any questions for our speakers, please direct them to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. I will now pass you on to our speakers, Mark Raymond and Nesreen Osman, who are partners at Pinsent Masons. Hi, Mark and Nesreen.
Well, good morning, I should say, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our seminar. I'd like to just briefly introduce myself, and I'll let Nesreen introduce herself. My name's Mark Raymont. You'll see a picture on the screen. Do not be alarmed. That's a fresh-faced young person staring out at you with my name next to his picture is in fact me. And one of the repercussions of the COVID lockdown, which we're going to be talking about in a little bit more detail this afternoon, but one of the positives is my ability and my opportunity to grow a lockdown beard. So it is indeed the same person, my evil twin brother. I'm head of the risk advisory services for Pinsent Masons in the Middle East, and we specialize in advising all parts of the construction and engineering sector. I've been based in the Middle East now for over 10 years in Dubai. Before that, I was based in the Far East, in Hong Kong, and prior to that, I was in Europe. And I mainly look at advising on large-scale infrastructure and energy-related projects, particularly in relation to disputes and dispute avoidance.
Thanks, Mark. My name's Nesreen. I am also a partner in the construction disputes team in Pinsent Mason's Dubai office. I have been in the Middle East for 7 years, and prior to that I was practicing in Scotland in the UK. As Mark said, we specialise in infrastructure disputes. The majority of my work is related to arbitrations, litigation, and the like. So without further ado, we will move on to today's topic.
So the main focus of the next hour or so is looking at some of the challenges and perhaps some of the opportunities in relation to the lockdown and what's going to happen next. And we're unashamedly going to be focusing on how things have transpired. I know a lot of people who've tuned in for this from their offices and their back bedrooms, etc., will be working from home still because of the implications and the various effects of the pandemic. Pinsent Masons is an international law firm. We have 26 offices around the globe, ranging from Perth in Scotland all the way through, actually the other way around, I was going to say Aberdeen in Scotland all the way through to Perth in Australia, via London, Paris, Middle East, Doha and Dubai, Johannesburg, Sydney. And what this means is that we have, as a firm, had huge experience all the way through when the pandemic first manifested itself in relation to dealing with its impacts. And I just wanted to put a slide on screen showing how we understand the impact on the construction industry of the pandemic. I don't know whether you can see that, but this is a snapshot taken a month or so ago now. And this is just looking at the impact on construction output around the world. And you'll see that there is a number of hotspots in terms of areas where the estimate and implication is that there's going to be a significant drop in construction output. If you look at the US, and also mainland Europe around Spain and France, and then over towards the Middle East. The 1st of May position was that there was a over 6% drop in construction output, and I think we can probably anticipate that that's going to continue. And as a law firm, we've seen the effects of the pandemic. We've seen it in the Far East, we've seen it here in the Middle East and in Europe. We've seen the issues that have arisen as a consequence to our clients' construction and engineering businesses, their projects, and we've advised them on a daily basis about how to deal with those issues. And we're now seeing in our colleagues in the Far East, as we're taking tentative steps out of the lockdown process there, some of the lessons learned, some of the issues that have been raised. And those are what we're going to be focusing on over the next hour or so. As I said, we're looking at it from a very practical perspective. And what we thought we'd do is we'd start off by effectively just laying out a little bit of a case study. And anybody who's been in the Middle East over the last 2 or 3 months will be very familiar with the way in which this all unfolded. And we're going to look at the issues that were raised as projects were effectively ramped down, suspended, and some of the challenges and issues that arose have to be made. And we're also going to look at some of just a little bit of horizon gazing as to the risks and opportunities as projects start ramping up again. And we'll look at that from a claims basis. We'll look at some of the particular issues in protecting yourself and also securing just entitlements, some best practice around record keeping and making claims. And as I've said, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at some of the opportunities. So let's just have a look at what's actually happened. I don't know how easy this screen is to see, but this sets out basically what happened. You know, we know that when around January, February, we started to hear about the situation in China and the Far East. Materials and supplies and equipment from the Far East were certainly impacted, as were travel arrangements. Senior personnel, management, etc., stranded or unable to leave their home jurisdictions, and particularly after the Chinese New Year, unable to rejoin projects, not just those run by Chinese companies, but Korean, Japanese, and others in the Far East. And that left the construction companies involved with those projects with a decision to make, whether they just try to carry on, whether they try to fill the gaps in personnel to resource material suppliers, whether they made any notices or gave any notices in relation to force majeure, etc., etc. And so we can see that from the top part of that slide, the impact on the projects, the question of whether there was an entitlement to an extension of time, whether they should continue to try and soldier on, or whether they should suspend the works. And we look on the bottom side of that slide, and we can see how the various different parties and stakeholders in the projects had their own decisions to make, whether the employer gave any instructions, whether the subcontractor could continue to work or should continue to work, and the decision-making processes that those parties had to go through in relation to make sure that they protected themselves. So let's have a look at that in a bit more granular detail. As I said, we're going to do this by way of a case study, and Nesreen is going to look at particular implications of all of this. So, you know, if, for example, we had an oil or some other very heavy engineering project, we know that Chinese New Year probably signalled the start of where the real impacts were held and felt, particularly in relation to those important bits of equipment that were being shipped from the Far East. There was probably some relatively minor impact, particularly in relation to personnel and labour issues, and questions as to whether or not the critical path and resequencing could be dealt with in a way that was going to mitigate the effects of those early stages. And question of what to do. Do you give your notice of force majeure? What mitigation measures were you going to be taking, and who was going to pay for those? So that was the early stages, but then things rapidly got serious and quite difficult. So if we look on to the next stage, we know that the infection rates in the Gulf suddenly rocketed, and that seemed to take a lot of the authorities by surprise. There's various recommendations made to operations on construction sites. There was social distancing started to be introduced. Employers were giving instructions that the contractor had to comply with the authority recommendations and decrees, and there was a degree of uncertainty as to the contractual status of those directives. So then we started seeing questions about whether or not that might constitute a variation, or indeed, depending on the contract, whether that could be characterized as a change in law, which might give you some entitlement to time and money. I know it is obviously invidious to talk in generalizations, but as a general rule, force majeure claims tend to go along the lines that you get as a contractor time but not money. And therefore we know that this was costing a lot of money, and who's going to pay for that, and looking at how the alternative claims might be put, and we'll explore that in a bit more detail as well. So that's what happened in the March period, and towards the end of March, as we all know, here in the UAE, there was eventually a full lockdown ordered of the population. Although there was special permits issued for key personnel and to allow work to continue on key construction projects, there were also decrees issued by the Ministry of Health relating to how labour and workers were to be dealt with, the working from home requirements. There was also issues around the transportation of labour and movement between the Emirates. And as a consequence, a number of construction sites were effectively shut down and works were suspended. So that's pretty much where we are today. As I've mentioned above, a number of potential claims that are bubbling around relating to FM, change of law, etc. Just having a quick peek into the future, we've seen in the Far East certainly, and to a certain extent here in the Middle East, certain projects are now ramping back up again. Part of the challenge here is that it's still slightly unclear about the legal status of some of the decrees. We know that, for example, in the UAE, the government's very keen to get people back to work, get the economy working again. There's certainly been an easing of the lockdown. However, as we've seen in Abu Dhabi with the sort of reimposition of travel restrictions over the last couple of weeks, which has just been extended, there are still continuing issues in relation to the movement of labour and resources. And there's no detailed guidance really as to how that's manifesting itself in the in a legal context, what the effect is on the contract. And of course, contractors, main contractors, subcontractors, suppliers and vendors and employers are all struggling at this stage to just work out how they can get their projects restarted. But more important probably is how to do it safely, but also to make sure that they preserve, their existing contractual rights, but also to the extent that they've incurred cost, that they can recover that in some way. So that's some of the things that we're looking at in terms of the ramping up. And before we move into the fine sort of granular detail of that, in terms of looking at how one protects oneself, the key point really is that you have to, as is always the way with these things, link cause with effect, the causation story as we referred it there. In terms of your contractual or indeed your commercial position, you need to make sure that you properly prepare yourself to make claims and indeed as an employer to answer the claims and deal with them. You've got to be able to substantiate the effect that the pandemic and the various directives, decrees and law changes have had on your business, on your project, on your resourcing, and the way in which you deployed that. And obviously you want to keep your options open. We're still in some degree of uncertainty. That may mean at some stage in the future you're going to have to sit down with your counterparties and renegotiate your contract to decide who's going to bear the costs or whether it should be shared. What impact is it going to have on project completion? And whether going forward the social distancing and continuing restrictions and how they're going to manifest themselves on how you work on site. So there's going to be negotiations going forward, or it may end up in some kind of dispute resolution or dispute. And at the moment, our advice to clients has been very much to focus on getting the basics right, making sure you know what it is that you suffered in terms of harm and loss, and to the best you're able to plan ahead for the future.
Thanks, Mark. So in this next section, we're just going to very quickly recap on the contractual treatment of COVID-19, focusing really on entitlement and on notices. Now, over the last few weeks, what is the contractual treatment of COVID-19? And the answer, as ever, lies in the contract, coupled, of course, with the common law and the civil codes as they might be applicable. So let's recap briefly on the likely candidates for entitlement to arise, just to set the scene. Now, in the context of COVID-19, there are several ways. We're probably all familiar with these by now and have perhaps relied on them already, so we won't dwell on them for too long. But the two key ones that we've seen used most are, of course, force majeure and change of law. Now, in terms of force majeure, obviously, that's an unforeseeable event, exceptional event, unavoidable, etc. And that event prevents a party from performing. Now, what is the actual event? Now, that's a good question because, you know, is it the pandemic itself or is it the government response to the pandemic? We need to look at what the contract says. You need to bear in mind, you know, is it civil law that's applying or common law that's applying? Does that event completely stop your works, or is it more of an impediment? And also, does that event entitle you to time only or to money as well? I mean, usually you would only get time or relief from LDs, relief from termination perhaps, but not money, and usually don't get disruption either. So that's force majeure. In terms of change in law, again, it's important to look at what the contract says. Most contracts provide for time and money where there's been a change of law event. But you need to consider what is the proper characterization of the relevant measure adopted by the government. So is it actually a change in law? Now, just pausing here for a moment, we know that here in the UAE, it hasn't always been clear. There has been some COVID-19 measures adopted, announced on social media, for example, or on media websites. And at that point in time, the exact status of these measures is really uncertain. And so naturally, contractors and people in the industry struggle to identify whether it was really a change of law or not. Now, the next one we're going to look at is instructions. Now, these are relatively straightforward. Quite often the employer will simply just issue an instruction to close down the site, etc. Another way that employers can be involved is obviously if they are seen to have impeded progress. So perhaps lack of access, lack of instruction, supervision. These can all be underlying sources of entitlement for a claim in relation to COVID-19. Another way that you might have entitlement is if you agree the measure. So it happens quite often that the employer and the contractor will agree what measures should be adopted on the site. So if that does happen, the question then becomes, well, have they agreed everything that's necessary? So have they agreed the impact of that instruction, and have they agreed the compensation that follows? And the last couple of two we're going to look at is just frustration and termination. Now, frustration usually applies if there's no force majeure clause, and there's an unforeseen event outside of the control of the parties, and that makes the performance of the obligation or the contract impossible. Or that it's transformed the obligation under the contract so radically that it's no longer what was intended, and it wouldn't be fair to hold the parties to it. And the other way is termination. Now, that is sometimes available for prolonged suspension under contract. So where the contract mandates a prescribed period duration for the suspension, after which termination is permitted. And of course, termination can sometimes be permitted for convenience, where in that scenario, the project is simply no longer viable because of the trading conditions brought about by COVID-19. We've also actually seen this used as a threat in some cases by employers to try to engineer an agreement in relation to COVID-19. So there's a lot of options available in terms of where entitlement to a claim might arise. And it might actually be a tactical decision that is made. It may depend on whether you want time only or whether you want time and money. And this will usually depend on a number of things: the contract, first of all, the substantive law, whether it's common law, civil law, and most importantly, it will depend on the facts. And so, as I said, it'd be a tactical choice, but heavily driven by the facts underlying it. And I guess we can look at it from a contractor's point of view, and this is the contractor making a choice, but obviously it works conversely for the employer's point of view as to what position they might want to adopt. And again, they will have to consider the position on the facts. And then there's a question of, well, what happens if those facts change? Again, it's vital in this present situation with COVID to keep an eye on and review frequently the reasons that the work is stopping and or the reasons that the work is slowing down, and obviously look to notify these appropriately. Now, just quickly touching on notices, for any claim to fly, the notice provisions have to be satisfied. And we're talking about notice provisions relating to claims, delays, disruption costs, etc. Now, sometimes notices are expressed as being condition precedent, and sometimes they're expressed as an obligation, which means that if you breach it, it might affect the quantum of your recovery, but doesn't necessarily kill your claim in its entirety. Now, things to look out for in terms of notices: what is actually required by the contract? Is it just an initial notice, or is it do you need to give subsequent notices after that? The other key thing to keep in mind is whether it's a condition precedent. Now, that's very important under common law jurisdictions like English law, but it's a slightly more relaxed approach is taken in some of the civil law countries, and particularly here in the Middle East. And the final point to bear in mind here is evolving circumstances. Now, in our case study, we saw that the site initially closed due to lack of supplies, lack of labour, but then it closed because of a change of law, and then the law changed again and the site reopened. So it might then have been a shortage of materials, or there might have been social distancing measures having an impact. So that the underlying reason keeps changing, and because of that, it's important to keep notifying, keep a track of what the underlying reason is, notify those circumstances, keep monitoring it, and so that you make sure that you've covered all your bases in terms of the underlying causes of your entitlement. That was a very quick run-through recap of entitlement and notices, and I suspect that many of you will have been considering these things and looking at the various ways that you could look to make your COVID-19 related claims and how your entitlements might have arisen. I'm going to hand over to Mark now, and he's going to take us through this process of ramping back up and the particular risks that might be involved during that process.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed, Nesreen. Now, I've been having a look at the Q&A box as well, and just to make it clear, we're more than happy to deal with your questions. So please do fire them in. We're going to try and make a little bit of time at the end to deal with them in a bit of detail. The thing that I'd want to talk about in a bit of detail is party relationships. As I said in my initial introduction, we know what's happened. We know how our projects have been and our contractual obligations have been affected to date by the pandemic and the various directives and measures that have been introduced. But what's going to happen going forward? And so there's some really important decisions to be made. And everybody involved in the project, each of the stakeholders, obviously has a slightly different take on the situation. And what we try to do in this slide is summarize, broadly speaking, and you know, there's always a risk of generalizations here, about the likely approach to the various parties. So the employer is in probably a reasonably comfortable position in the sense that they can usually avoid having to make any specific decisions about whether or not the work can proceed or not, because generally the contract will put a lot of responsibility on the contractor who's doing the work to decide whether it's safe or not, whether or not the site can reopen, whether they can execute the works in a safe and orderly fashion in compliance with whatever the social distancing and other requirements are in terms of the present regulations. So the employer can take a step back. Obviously, if the employer is very keen for the project to start up again and for the works to be finished, then of course he needs to take a more proactive approach. In relation to the contractor, well, they cannot afford to avoid making a decision. Are the piggy in the middle, if I can put it that way, between the employer on the one hand and their supply chain down the line, the subcontractors, vendors, suppliers, etc., etc. So the main contractor, and we'll be looking mainly at their position over the next few slides, is the one that has to make some serious decisions and make sure that they don't prejudice themselves and their rights up the line or lay themselves open down the line to claims by their subcontractors. And we've mentioned there how important it is to look at your contractual relationships. For example, if you're a main contractor, you need to decide, well, are my subcontractors' obligations back to back with my own obligations to the employer? And in those circumstances, I mustn't do anything that would allow arguments to be raised that the back-to-back chain has somehow been broken. And what you don't want as a main contractor is to be exposed to potential claims by your subcontractor, which you cannot pass on to the employer. So the key there, as I said a little earlier, is the relationship between cause and effect. So as we've said, our specimen project was initially affected at the end of February, beginning of March. It may have been that certain activities were suspended or couldn't be performed as quickly as you would have hoped or planned for. There may be materials and equipment which were slowed down. And then in March, we had the real, the real full force of the pandemic hit. We had the suspensions and the shutdowns. Key to show cause and effect, key to show how it is that you were affected and whether it was by the law change, whether it was by an instruction from the employer, whether it was by a subcontractor saying, I'm sorry, I've got an infection in my labour camp, we cannot provide any work gangs at the moment. And you need to be able to establish the various different causes of the delays or additional costs, and then you need to be able to substantiate the effects. So you need to make sure that you have very detailed records, that you've made your relevant notifications under the contract, that you established an audit trail to show how you kept the records, how you've recorded the underlying data, etc., etc. So that's really from the main contractor's perspective. From a subcontractor's position, essentially the subcontractor is looking to the main contractor to take the lead? Is it going to provide an instruction to restart the works? Is it going to provide an instruction in relation to resequencing to take account of the issues that have arisen? Is it a variation? You've got to think quite carefully about how you couch your correspondence with the other parties. So you've got a number of issues there which I've flagged, which you need to look at. For example, it may be that you can start the works or restart the works, but it's still going to be disrupted. It may be that you can actually undertake certain activities, but they are going to take longer, and there'll be additional costs associated with them because you need to get more labour involved because of social distancing requirements. And it may be, going back to the example of the infections in the labour camp, it may be that you need to source labour and manpower from elsewhere because people simply aren't available or they're in quarantine. But again, from a subcontractor's position, and you'll see that there's a bit of a theme emerging here, you need to make sure that you know exactly what the cause and effect was, where the records are. You need to make sure you've given your relevant notices, and you've got an audit trail. You've got an audit trail which allows you to back up and substantiate where you say you've got claims. So, as I said, the main contractor is effectively the piggy in the middle. He's in a unique position of commercial exposure, both up the line and down the line. You need to think very carefully about how you can make sure that your contract remains back to back. You need to look at what's been said to you by the employer. Has he given you instructions, or has he done something that might be counted as being an instruction? It may not necessarily be in writing. It might be something that he said to you during a meeting. He might have said, we're very, very keen for you to continue the work. Do whatever you can. What does that mean? Make sure you've recorded that. So you need to also consider about reducing your exposure. So I mentioned already, the importance of record keeping, but you also need to make sure that you're completely on top of your contractual relationships, not just with the employer, but with your subcontractors and other vendors, and look at the management and coordination obligations that you have under those supply side arrangements. But also, to what extent can you pass on some of those responsibilities to your subcontractor? So you need to undertake a balancing act. You need to obviously keep good relationships between the other stakeholders, but at the same time, you need to build up your own contractual position in order to make sure you safeguard your own rights. Just briefly looking at the subcontractors, there is, as I said, it's not as if you can take a step back and just let the main contractor get on with it. If you've got claims, you need to bring them up as soon as possible. There may be notice requirements in your own subcontract which you need to comply with. You need to make sure that you have a dialogue with your own supply chain and your own subcontractors and equipment suppliers, etc., etc. Again, you need to be sure that you're recording your progress and identifying the delays that have occurred, the cause and effect, as I've mentioned earlier, and make a careful note of the reasons for the delay and disruption that's been caused. And it's also, we talked about record keeping, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail, but it is absolutely key. But the other thing is really important is to the extent that it's commercially possible, to share records as much as you can, both as a subcontractor with the main contractor, but as well as the main contractor and the employer. So there is transparency as to what is happening, so that it doesn't come as a surprise, and you've got a record which you can show and use to back up any future claims or what have you that you need to make.
Thanks, Mark. So that was a quick run through the potential risks of how you can manage the relationships between the parties during these COVID situation. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at delay and disruption claims in particular. Before I do that, I guess it's just worthwhile spending just a little bit of time talking about the difference and differentiating really between the situation where you have a site stoppage scenario and where you have more enduring impact of the bitty measures that we are seeing. So if there's been a period of site stoppage during the lockdown, I guess there's a couple of things to consider. You need to, first of all, you'll have to establish the state of progress of the works when that shutdown started. And then you'll need to consider the impact of demobilization, remobilization, etc. But otherwise, it might be relatively straightforward to gauge that period of delay during site stoppage. But regardless of any actual stoppage, delay is also likely to accrue because of things like the impact on the supply of materials and products, the availability of labor, inefficient methods of working to ensure the safety measures are complied with. So those things could actually have a much more enduring impact on the project than a straightforward site shutdown. Engaging the delay caused in that way is going to be a lot more challenging. And I think that puts an even greater emphasis on recording what happened, when, and why. So let's have a look at the main ingredients that are needed for a delay claim. 4 items on the slide there. We've pretty much covered the first 2. So the next few minutes, we're just going to look at the critical impact on completion date and then also on mitigation measures. So we need to look at how we gauge that the claim event has actually and we need to look at what evidence we need. So we look at what might have happened, what should have happened if things had gone to plan. To do that, we need to look at the baseline program, of course, the original one, and look at whether that was realistic, was it right? If not, is now the time to fix it? Now we also need to look at whether it's up to date. If it's not up to date, should that be progressed up to the date of the COVID impact? We need to also make sure that it includes the delays that had been incurred to date. Next, we need to look at what actually did happen, and that will involve looking at your progress data. Now, you need to keep and collate the records of all the planning and mitigation decisions that were made, basically what decisions were made and why. You look at the rolling as-built data, again, what happened, when and why. And as I mentioned earlier, the impact of site shutdown situation might be relatively clear-cut, but other COVID measures, which are ongoing and ever-changing, might actually not only just disrupt those works, but they may also delay the works as well. So again, it's a second form of delay that's likely to be more insidious and difficult to analyse. And it's all the more reason why recording what happened contemporaneously is going to be key. And it'll eventually allow you to investigate the position and, more importantly, evidence that position if you have claims. And then looking at the why, to explain the why, you will need rich real-time data of what happened, when, and why. So your best evidence really in that situation is your documents, your factual witnesses, and your expert opinion, and I would say it's in that order. Looking at mitigation, it's worth noting at the outset that subject to any express contractual provisions, the contractor will usually have an obligation to mitigate the effects of the delay, but not necessarily to accelerate. And that distinction is quite important, and it's usually what the contractor can do at no material extra cost, which is mitigation, versus what the contractor can do by incurring further costs, which often constitutes acceleration. So looking first at the duty to mitigate, and what does that actually mean in practice? We've had a lot of queries about this here in the Middle East. We've had clients asking us, what does that really mean? Do we continue to work? Do we scale back? Should we try and get supplies from elsewhere? Should we be paying more for those supplies? Should we be looking to stagger our work patterns, maybe move to a shift system? Does it go so far as requiring a contractor, let's say, to put in place a backup team in case one of the teams is infected and has to isolate. So it's not always clear, but as always, the best place to start is the contract. And I would say that beyond that, there's a whole host of different things that a contractor can do. And there's also a whole host of things that you're probably required to do under your contract. And just touching briefly on acceleration, as I said earlier, the duty to mitigate does not mean you have an obligation to accelerate, unless of course your contract says so. One thing you do need to do when you're accelerating is to try and distinguish clearly between the acceleration that you might have been doing to deal with your own pre-existing delays before the COVID event hit, and any acceleration you might take to mitigate the COVID-19 delays. Now, aside from that, I think the contractor might have a bit of a dilemma on their hands in relation to acceleration in response to these COVID-19 delays. Let's say the contractor is delayed and the employer or the engineer won't give an EOT. Now, the contractor might be faced with a question or pressure of whether to accelerate just in case the EOT is not ultimately awarded. And it may well see that as the sort of least worst option and just take its chance on the recovery of costs. Now, I guess the caution there is that without an instruction to accelerate, a contractor might be left in a somewhat difficult world of constructive acceleration, which is quite difficult to prove. Now, just to finish up on delay and just a few tactical tips that we have. There's a couple of these, and the first one is to record and circulate these things that I put up on the slide on an ongoing basis during this ramp-up process. So things like your state of progress, your delays and the reasons for those delays, the rate of progress, the rate of productivity, what's on the critical path, specific works that might be directly impacted. And that's going to be especially relevant if there's some parts of the works that can continue and others can't. And also any ability you might have to reduce or redirect your resources. And the second tip is specifically on head office overhead claims. Now, if you're finding that you are declining tenders because of an overrun on a particular project, it's going to put you in really good stead to record that in board minutes with reasons. And what you can then do is refer back to that, and it will give you a good platform to use the formula approach to recovering your head office overheads and profits. Now, just touching on the ingredients required for disruption. So we've covered the events and we've also covered the notices earlier. So I'll jump straight on to what should have happened, what went wrong, what did happen. Now, looking at what should have happened, here you'll need to show what would have been your productivity, but for the impact of the virus. So to do this, you'll need to assess your baseline productivity. How would you have done the work? What resources you would have used? What costs you would have incurred? Now, usually this relies on the tender. So that needs to have been verified for reasonableness and then updated to the pre-COVID reality. So up to that disruption event. So for example, taking into account things like variations and things like that. The best evidence is the documents. So then it's going to be the evidence of those who compiled the tender, and then perhaps expert evidence on the reasonableness of that tender. Next, looking at what went wrong. So we're looking at the causes of the disruption. And this is going to be a matter of fact. And again, the hierarchy for your evidence for this is going to be your documents. Your documents are king and they're crucial. The witness evidence, you can use that to explain what happened clearly and honestly. And then obviously the expert evidence, which will be used to summarize and synthesize the facts behind the event. And I think the key thing to remember is that it really will turn on the contemporaneous evidence. The expert cannot retrospectively create a case for disruption if there's no documents to support it. And then looking at what did happen. So that's to say, what was the effect of that disruption? So as Mark mentioned earlier, it's all about the cause and the effect. We're looking at the effect. This is probably the most challenging component in the equation. A contractor will have to show the impact of the virus or the disruption event on the baseline, and then disentangle that from the effects on productivity of any of the other unrelated issues that may have taken place. And that's not so easily done. A tribunal or a judge will allow some latitude. It doesn't have to be exact, it can be an approximation, but the claims really do need to be deglobalized. As I say, the cause and the effect have to be linked as best you can. And you could do this by reviewing it by area or by activity, by period, etc. There isn't a set way. And certainly in the common law, the case law has shown that a contractor can pretty much use whatever approach it chooses to support a reasoned assessment of that disruption. But it has to do, what it has to do is verify its baseline and then provide the contemporaneous evidence that it suffered that disruption and how much disruption there was. Again, the hierarchy here is the same as before. It's your documents, and we'll come on to record keeping in a little bit. Again, your witness statements, so use your witness and factual evidence to string all the documents together and fill in the gaps. It doesn't have to be precise, but the evidence has to be honest and anchored obviously in your documents. And again, you've got your expert evidence, and that's really the icing on the top. There's various different ways to prove a disruption claim, and some of those are listed there in the slide. But I would emphasize that the expert can assist with the productivity analysis, but they can't create a case for nothing. And touching just briefly on quantum, we've just spoken about the various different analytical techniques that you can use, and they'll help you to identify the quantum of the disruption and the additional resource. Is probably the measured mile approach. And the nature of the COVID scenario that we have ongoing at the moment and the impact is such that unusually this might well be, or there might well be an unpolluted period of production against which you can measure post-COVID production. So this might be one of the few scenarios where you can really properly use the measured mile approach. But of course, that's not the only technique available, and a lot of experts have very different views on that. And just to round off on disruption, some tips again on how to deal with your claims. In terms of your baseline, we're talking about keeping a record and collating your tender, the build-up, programs, in terms of your updated baseline, your progress reports, your variations, productivity records. In terms of looking at your actual position, obviously record what happened and when, for how long, and most importantly, why. And that has to be for all events, not just the COVID-19. And it has to be by reference to the baseline. So record things like the specific works that are directly impacted, and why. So was it site access? Was it lack of labor? Was it travel restrictions? There's a whole host of things it could be with the ongoing situation with COVID. But also look out for things like an over-optimistic tender or potentially poor planning or management, and bear those in mind. And it's important, I think, and helpful to think about the potential challenges that might come to your disruption claim. So it could be things like, well, you didn't notify in accordance with the contract. That's a fairly straightforward challenge that we see often made. It could be that the baseline is actually bigger than what you've asserted. It could be that your narrative isn't supported by the facts. So for example, if they wanted to make a negative case, you could just say, well, this cause just didn't happen. There was other things that happened, and give a positive case. Also in terms of the effect, it could be arguments made that the claim didn't cause more work or more cost, or they might argue that actually the real true cause of the disruption were other things. And also an argument could be made that the claim's actually too global. There's no linkage between the cause and the effect. You've not linked the claim event to the disruption. So these are all things to bear in mind when putting together your disruption claim in order to maximize the chances of having a successful claim. Now I'm going to move on quickly now just onto record keeping and best practice. I think we can't overemphasize how important the record keeping is, and really we just want to talk about some best practice in terms of record keeping. I would say that as we move into this recovery position, it's important to bear in mind that what we're talking about is a forward-looking exercise. Where we are at the moment, we're at the end or coming to the end of a short, sharp shock on a lot of the construction projects, but we're moving into a much longer and more nuanced period of disruption and further delays. So when we talk about best practice and record keeping, we're not talking about it just from the perspective of the end of a project or the end of a period of delay and disruption. We're actually talking about it from the middle of it, or perhaps even from the end of the beginning of it. What we do know is that this is a process that is underway and it will keep going. So if we look at where we are now, looking at the status quo, as I said earlier, it's important that we capture the position as it is right now. Invest in harvesting and organizing your records and the data that you have. What current experience is showing us is that it's very important. A very important aspect of that is, of course, your program. That is having an updated project program up to the point where the COVID event happens. And then the impact of that needs to be recorded. And again, as things change somewhat from this initial short, sharp shock into something potentially more lasting, a lot of people are referring to this as the new normal. It's probably a good time to reboot that project program and draw a line in the sand to say, this is where we are at the moment. We'll be able to assess and we'll be able to assess this going forward using our progress and also taking account of our delays. It's important to have that program up to date and that it's has loaded into all of the delays experienced, and so that it has an accurate look ahead as to how the work can progress in this new normal. And also the other thing is to be looking to audit your contracts and your securities, just to identify the risk points that you might have. In terms of project management, again, I think it's important to test your thinking and revisit the decisions that you've made on a frequent basis. So that goes towards a number of issues. First of all, as I said earlier, the way a contractor might want to update or amend their contractual position as events unfold. So whether it's possible to switch streams from a force majeure assertion perhaps to a change in law assertion. That's all part of this idea of revisiting the decisions frequently. Part of the story might also be revisiting the decisions made in relation to the story of causation. What's the true cause of what's going on here? Is it something the employer did? Is it something the government did? Is it perhaps something, a consequence of something the subcontractor did? So it's important to revisit all these decisions as you go along and just work out what are you hanging your hat on in terms of entitlement. And then finally, I guess it's important to revisit decisions taken as to what steps you've taken to mitigate. So again, you want to make sure that you're clearly distinguishing your mitigation from acceleration. And then in terms of contractual protection, I mean, the obvious one is giving notices and updating them. There will often also be a positive obligation for you to update your details or the particulars of the claim as you go along. And then basically you'll need to ramp up your record keeping so that you can fulfill these obligations and maintain that as a discipline as we come into the recovery and then emerge out of the worst phase of COVID. I touched earlier on rich data and recording why decisions were being made. And it's important right now to have a good idea of why those decisions were being made at different points in time in the past. And the why is something that can kind of get lost as time goes on. So it's important that you nail that down in your data, all the evidence that you have as to why decisions were made at the time. And then record keeping. Now, I think to look at record keeping and the idea of the best in class data that you can keep. I think it's important to particularly in relation to delay and disruption claims, to bear this in mind. I've already spoken about this in terms of entitlement to EOT, but also when it comes to disruption. And the idea, I think, is that this might be one of those moments where you can possibly use the measured mile approach in its purest form. So it's key to remember and keep and collate all of these records. Records you should be looking at keeping, obviously, are on the slide there. The program is pretty obvious. We can't stress enough how important that is. The progress records, obviously, as you go along. It's important to look at your resources, both in terms of numbers, but also the productivity that they have been able to achieve. Because a lot of social distancing, for example, is something that's going to impact on productivity probably considerably. And then obviously, finally, the costs and how they've been incurred along the way. Now, it's important to be proportionate, but we would say that it's also important to boost your record keeping right now, and invest now in time and people to make sure that your record keeping is up to scratch, and it's maintained throughout this recovery period. Now, on this next slide is I guess it's just a shopping list of things that you should really think about keeping throughout this period. On the left-hand side is obviously your contract documents, very important, both up the line and down the line. Through the middle there is your progress records, so your baseline program, have it updated. Of course, this will eventually lend itself to some very sophisticated analysis in terms of your delay and your disruption. Reviewing the state of progress and the reasons for it, your production output, daily detailed progress reports. Again, as a platform for formula approach, these will be really important. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the cost record, both up the line and down the line. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say on best practice and record keeping for now. I'll pass back over to Mark just now for some concluding remarks coming out of today's session.
Thanks very much, Nesreen. I guess there's lots of food for thought there, and I imagine most of us on this webinar will be dealing with the various challenges and fires that have been caused by the environment and the construction sector that we're in at the moment, and probably not really thinking too much about the future. But it's obviously important to think about the future, do a little bit of horizon gazing. In terms of opportunities, obviously the key thing is to make sure that your opportunities to mitigate your position in terms of the delays and costs that you suffered, so that you don't suffer and are able to get, to the extent that you're able, compensation is really important. And all the things we've talked about, record keeping a close eye on how you're going to be able to demonstrate cause and effect on your claims, etc., will be very much part of that going forward, to make sure that you can get your just entitlements. I guess there's a wider question about what the construction sector is going to look like when we get to whatever might be the new normal. I suspect there's going to be some fairly significant changes, both in relation to the built environment and indeed the culture of a lot of construction companies. Built environment, are we going to need offices and big areas where big teams of people can work and collaborate together physically? Well, at the moment it appears that we're moving away from that, and the success of a lot of people working from home and being able to deal with work and other issues from their homes, it's shown it can be done. It's perhaps not the easiest thing, but that's going to probably play into agile working, having an agile workforce, being able to deal with the restrictions on movement and social distancing that's going forward. And those companies that can adapt the best, and their critical resource, their personnel, you can encourage them to do that, will probably be the ones that come out of this the stronger, as well as looking at what they can supply to the construction sector, use of technology, ways of repurposing areas, looking at agile working environments, and how best to maximize flexibility is going to be really key. But ultimately, it's got to be said that cash is king. We're in an environment where there's a huge pressure on payment. There's a huge pressure on funds. Those who've got the money want to keep it. Those that have lost out need compensation, want to get it. So all the things that we've been talking about over the last hour are absolutely key to that. So I think in conclusion, I think we can say that clearly the COVID pandemic has been unprecedented, and we're still trying to work out what that means in practice. Clearly there's also been delay and disruption, and we saw that slide I showed you earlier about construction output and what effect that had as at the 1st of May, and we can guarantee that that's going to be increasing and intensifying. You need to make sure that you have really good record-keeping practices and protocols in place. It may be that whatever happens, you're going to have a discussion with your subcontractors, your supply chain, your employer and your main contractors as to what's going to happen next. And making sure that you're in the strongest possible position when those discussions and negotiations come is going to be really important. I've mentioned cash flow already, but the other thing which we haven't really talked about, because it's pretty much a seminar in its own right, is insolvency. It's insolvency in the supply chain and possibly up and down downstream of the main contract as well is almost inevitable. Make sure that you keep your eyes and ears open for that. Make sure that you are following the progress of your counterparties to make sure that they are going to be able to pay their bills. Ultimately, if you don't do these things, you are putting your business at risk. If you do these things well, you are doing yourself a favour and you're doing your business a favour, and you're making, as well as you can, the right circumstances for successful long-term trading and projects in the UAE. So with that, I'm going to finish. I don't think there's a huge amount of time, but we're more than willing to answer some of your questions. I don't know, Nesreen, whether you had a chance to have a quick look at some of the questions. I had a brief look before I started the closing remarks. I can deal with a couple very quickly. There was a question as to whether or not Pinsent Masons had an office in the Caribbean to provide construction and engineering legal advice. I'm sad to say that we don't, but obviously very happy to consider that. We'll let you know if that ever happens. Nesreen, was there any particular questions that caught your eye?
I'm just having, I spotted one a second ago. Where's it going?
Okay, well,
yeah, so sorry, I was just going to, there's a question in the UAE, in case of contradiction between civil code and conditions of contract in relation to contractors' entitlement for EOT and related cost, what would be your advice? I mean, generally the position in the UAE is that the parties are free to contract, and there are certain provisions of the civil code that are mandatory that will apply anyway. But other than that, the parties are free to contract as they see fit. So even with things like force majeure, there are force majeure provisions in the civil code. And so if your contract doesn't have a force majeure provision in it, then the law will apply. But if parties have taken the time to agree a force majeure clause, that is the clause that will be followed. So it really depends. Where we have mandatory provisions, these are for things like design liability, and also the provision that allows you to increase or decrease liquidated damages. So they will apply regardless. So if you've agreed liquidated damages in your contract, and you haven't actually suffered the loss, but you're looking to recover LDs anyway, the other side could argue that the civil law prevents you from doing that, and the courts could reduce your damages down to the loss that's actually suffered.
Thanks very much for that, Nesreen. There was a question a little earlier which I read, which was quite an interesting one, and effectively it said international contracts and construction contracts tend not to specifically reference COVID-19. Is it likely that we will be seeing specific provisions introduced going forward, which will deal with it? So I think the short answer is that that's correct. Obviously, COVID, nobody even heard of it before December last year, so it's unsurprising it's not specifically dealt with in contracts, and I'm pretty sure that it will be reflected in new contracts that are let going forward. And in fact, we're aware as a firm with the advice and cases that we get involved with where we're advising on procurement contracts, then having a plan of action in place to deal with COVID-related issues is very much at the forefront of people's thinking. So I think we will start seeing clauses introduced which deal specifically with the effects of this. I also suspect that we'll see amendments being made to change of law change of law clauses. At the moment, they do provide a potential avenue for recovery for contractors. We know that force majeure clauses do generally refer to events which include epidemics. I think a pandemic is probably a form of epidemic. In fact, it may even be worse than that. So you could say that actually, even though it's not specifically referenced, it kind of is covered, or certainly some contracts do cover it. I do think we'll be seeing tightening up of change of law clauses. We've also seen clauses in contracts, we haven't really talked about it here, where a contractor is required to follow any changes in health and safety provisions from the employer, which might give time and money. So again, I suspect that might be an avenue for claim, but also in the future we'll see that being tightened up as well. So I think the short answer is we expect that there will be a reflection in contracts being let going forward of the lessons that have been learned during the current pandemic.
I would add to that, Mark, that we saw this clauses. Some were amended after the Arab Spring to deal with the scenario of civil unrest and riots and blockades. And the interesting thing at the moment actually is that those clauses were amended to allow recovery of things like standby time. So even though force majeure may not necessarily allow you to recover costs, allow you time, there's these exceptions in relation to civil unrest and blockades. And what we're seeing at the moment is some contractors looking to use those provisions, especially those that are not drafted in a very tight way, to say, well, actually, the blockades happening in the sea waters, for example, of some of the Gulf countries who've closed off their sea borders, that falls under that provision, is a blockade, and therefore they're entitled to recover standby costs. So it's helpful in some ways because it allows recovery of some costs, although it may not be the entirety of your prolongation costs, for example.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much for that, Nesreen. I'm conscious the time's marching on, so we'll deal with a couple more questions very quickly. One of them is under the force majeure clause, we are allowed to stop work and renegotiate the contract to find a mutual agreement. If no agreement is reached and therefore termination is on the cards, is the employer allowed to pull the bonds? Well, I'm very sad to say that that's actually been a bit of a feature over the last few months, certainly as far as some of our clients have been concerned. As we all know, on-demand bonds are very much a feature in the Middle East, and it allows the beneficiary to call on the bonds with a written demand without necessarily having the justification to do so. So that is very much a real risk at the moment. It also, obviously depends on the nature of the contract, and I can't really comment on specifics. What I would say is that if you've got a contract that does allow the parties or provides a mechanism for the parties to renegotiate the completion date or the cost of whatever in relation to an event which could not have been foreseen, there has to be an element of reasonableness and good faith in those negotiations, which, even if it's not expressed in the contract, is required under UAE law. As long as the negotiations and the approach is undertaken in good faith, if the other party decides to call the bond, then as I said, there's not much you can do to stop them, except maybe going to the court for a precautionary attachment, and that's not easy at all. But if you can demonstrate some element of bad faith in that, then you might have some success there. So it does seem, I'd say, tending towards that if the contract did allow a negotiation and they had been undertaken by the party who gave the bond in good faith. Calling the bonds in those circumstances, I'd say, might be give some opportunity to go to the courts. Okay.
Do we have time for any more questions?
I think we are out of time. Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Mark and Nesreen. I don't know if you want to just quickly go to the slide with your contact details. Yeah, perfect. And I guess if everyone wants to send any more questions, that they can contact you. Yeah, so thank you guys very much for your time today, and thank you very much to our attendees. I just want to remind everyone that we will send the recording and the presentation to you via email within the next week. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Nesreen.
Okay, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Keep safe, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.